All right, so I'm starting the recording now. So I got published. Now what? Well, first off, celebrate. Yay. It may sound silly and go without saying, but I think it's really important to take that moment to own your accomplishment, savor it, feel good about it when it happens. Okay. So we want to take that moment to celebrate ourselves. Okay, really, now what? After we're done throwing ourselves a party. The things we're going to talk about today are promoting your work, maintaining your online profile, maintaining your pipeline of research, and then tracking and communicating the impact of your work. So begin with promoting your work. We want to think about different ways that we can get the word out. I have goals, things that I want my research to accomplish. I want to change something, affect something. I can't do that if no one finds it and reads it. So thinking about some options here. Posting to your personal social media channels. Maybe nobody else you know on social media is in your field, but you never know what other connections they may have further on down their own chains. So post to your own channels, tag any of your work colleagues, your university colleagues, friends, anybody who might reshare and get the word out. Think about within your institution who you might communicate with. So the marketing office, the official social media channels of the university, the Office of Research, they all might have different avenues for promoting the work of researchers at the institution. That's a goal for them as well. It makes the institution look good. It gets their visibility up. So they want to help you share and promote your work. Alumni networks, previous universities that you have attended and obtained degrees from, they often have channels for putting out news and updates on things that their alumni are doing. See if you can reach out to them and get, whether it's just a little blurb, put in an alumni magazine somewhere, get the word out somewhere on what you've published so that other people can find it. Professional association newsletters and their social media channels. So whatever kinds of professional associations you may belong to within your discipline, they will often have, again, newsletters, email listservs, social media channels, ways that they can get out the news about recent accomplishments of their association members. Professional listservs, in many cases, will belong to email-based groups of people in our discipline who ask each other questions and chat about things going on in the field. Promote your work there. Depending on what field you're working in and what the goal of your work is. Sometimes our goal is really to target other scholarly researchers, but in some fields we're trying to get a word out to practitioners. Maybe that's teachers in the classroom or doctors and nurses in the medical offices in the hospitals. Sometimes we're trying to get the word out to policymakers in government because we want to change public policy regulations. So whatever kind of special target audiences your work might have who wouldn't necessarily be well targeted in just those scholarly research networks, think about how you could reach out and communicate to them. Conferences obviously are another great avenue within your disciplinary communities, whether that's actually giving a presentation talk or just displaying a poster that shares some ideas of the work you published. Sometimes we do that before we publish, we can do it afterwards as well. Scholarly Works at SHSU. This is our institutional repository here on campus. This is a tool where we want to showcase the research outputs of our faculty and students. So we provide a stable place to host any works that you want to share. It gets them indexed in Google. It makes them more widely discoverable by people out there searching for those topics. And it also gives you a stable, permanent URL that you could put into a resume or a CV to, even after you've left Sam Houston, you'll always have that stable place where you can link people back to the work that you put there. You can usually deposit published articles, but there's a lot of variation on what version of the article you can share, just based on the policies of the specific journal. You may not be able to post the fancy polished PDF that they actually create, but you may be able to share the last revised version of your Word document. So there's some rules and things we have to work with there. we in the library will help you to determine that kind of information, to determine what you can share. But even thinking beyond published articles, you can also use our repository to host conference posters, conference presentations, data sets, images that you create as part of your research, any other kinds of supplementary material that may need a home. And then we want to keep our scholarly profiles updated with the details of our work. So this segues nicely into our next segment of maintaining our online profiles. When we're talking about online profiles, some of you have probably been exposed to things like Google Scholar profiles, where Google will maintain a page about a researcher. We're often also familiar with sites like ResearchGate that are kind of mainstream and visible. So those are the kinds of things I mean when I'm talking about our online profiles. LinkedIn is one of them, not academically focused, but there are ways to work with it in academic ways. ORCID, which is a nonprofit researcher identifier. Impact Story, which is also nonprofit. Google Scholar profiles, recognizing, of course, that it's benefiting the for-profit Google Corporation. Mendeley profiles is one that has existed up till now, but if anyone is aware of it and not aware, they are closing down Mendeley profiles. Mendeley itself is a tool for managing citations and references. That part of the tool will still exist. They're phasing out their online profile piece. ResearchGate and academia.edu, both of which are for-profit websites. And the main reason that I make a distinction between the nonprofits and the for-profits is simply so that people can make informed choices based on their own values. When you share information about your work on the for-profit sites, they have permission to then reuse that information in other ways that benefits them, that may or may not benefit you. So I think it just is worth being informed about some of those distinctions. So we've got a lot of these larger, more general academic things. And then we also find some smaller discipline-specific tools that are often called academic social networks. Biomed Experts is one I'm aware of, that's specifically for people working in biomedicine. Those are becoming less common than they were like 12 years ago. People have gravitated more towards using the larger interdisciplinary ones. But depending on the field that you're in, you may be aware of people that congregate on one of those smaller platforms. So that may be valuable for you if that's there. We want to kind of think about how many of these do we really want to focus our energy on. We could spend an awful lot of time keeping all of these types of profiles up to date. So I really recommend choosing one up to maybe three to really focus the majority of your energy based on what seems most strategic in your discipline. Looking at each platform, you can search the users that are there. Try to see, are you seeing other people who work in your field broadly and then also your kind of specialized area of the field? Do they look like they're a mix of established scholars or just kind of new, graduate students coming into the field as researchers? So get a sense of who is in that space, because if the people you want to be speaking to aren't there, it's not worth your time to really put a lot of energy into being there either. You also want to compare the kinds of features they make available. One platform may really emphasize publications above all else. Another platform might have more accommodation for things like conference presentations, grant funding, things like that. One may act as more of just a resume. It's just sort of a static document that shows your accomplishments. Another one may involve more networking features to connect you to potential collaborators. And you want to think about how do all those different capabilities align to your interests and your priorities moving forward with your research. You want to think about how easy it is to keep it updated. Some of these tools link in automatically with other tools. So for instance, Google Scholar profiles, they're constantly searching for new work that they see on the web that they think is attributed to you, and they'll try to automatically add your new work to your profile. So they'll do a certain amount of work to try to help you keep it updated. Similarly with ORCID, you can set up a link to Crossref, which is a standardized platform where publishers share all of the information about their table of contents. So on your ORCID profile, it will automatically pull in things from Crossref that it can tell are attributable to you. So think about features like that that will help you keep it updated, not so manually. Try to find out whether you can find your profile there in Google. Would someone Googling for your name come upon that profile? That's going to make it instantly more functional, more useful. And then again, how does that nonprofit or for-profit status align with your values? We often have to create a few of these and just play around with them before we get comfortable with where we want to live, where we want to do our work. If you started one out to just get a feel for it and you decide you really don't want to put in the energy to maintain that one, I do recommend that you go ahead and delete that profile or set it to private, or whatever sort of capacity that platform has for you to hide or remove that profile. That way it doesn't continue to just sort of hang out there in the ether as this outdated representation of you. And then once you've settled on a couple of these platforms that you want to work with, create some kind of a review schedule for yourself, whether that's once a month, once a semester, every quarter, once a year, whatever feels comfortable to you based on your current level of output. Just set a schedule and stick to it. For, I'm going to take 30 minutes. I'm going to log into this site. I'm going to go through the information and make sure everything is still as up to date as possible. And that way, people who are looking at you will continue to see relatively updated information. And partly that is also about keeping yourself informed of what's changing with the platform. They may remove features, they may add new features, and you may want to be keeping up with how you can make your profile more functional as their platform evolves. You also really need to consider what you can post where. A lot of these platforms, I'm going to single out ResearchGate, some of them will be very pushy about telling you that you should post a whole copy of your article on their site and make it easily accessible to other people in that network. There's often message requests that come through from other people saying they want to read your paper. And so the site will tell you, oh, you should upload it. Sometimes that's fine, sometimes it's not. As I said earlier, there are usually rules for each journal about what you can post, where, and when, like how soon after publication can you post it. Some journals, some publishers have much stricter rules specifically targeted at the for-profit platforms. They may allow you to post immediately on our SHSU repository, but they may require you to wait 18 months before you can post an article on ResearchGate. So it pays to be aware and to be careful about those kinds of permissions. Okay, so we're going to do a short activity now. I'm putting a link in the chat to a Padlet. And on that Padlet, I've got a link to each platform and a link to like a sample profile, a person's profile on each platform. We're just going to take a couple of minutes, pick a platform to look at, especially if it's one that you're not as familiar with, and just spend a few minutes looking at the sample profile, look at the features there. You can search for other users if you want. Just get a little bit of a feel for that platform. And then we're going to share some anonymous notes on that Padlet together about what you like, what you don't like, what you find attractive or not about that platform. So we're going to take about 5 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes. For the benefit of those watching this later, I'm going to pause recording while we take this activity break. I'm going to resume recording now and we'll chat about it a little bit. I was reading some of your comments. This comment about the ORCID profiles that it feels a bit cluttered. I kind of agree. I don't really love the way that their page is just one giant column of text from top to bottom. It's a lot. It's very cluttered. They have some work to do on the design of the page, but it is very simple. Very simple to use, very simple to read. One of the things to be aware of with ORCID, their kind of initial core function is actually as an identifier. So it's a little bit like an academic social security number that identifies you uniquely as an individual. Even as you change institutional affiliations, even as perhaps you change name for any variety of reasons in life. Your ORCID ID always uniquely represents you. So it helps to make sure that all of your publications and other accomplishments are tied together, regardless of the way that your name may be written on one paper. So I do recommend that everyone register for an ORCID number, even if you decide you don't care to make use of the rest of the profile, just so that you know you have that number. Journals in some fields are increasingly requiring you to provide your ORCID ID number when you submit an article. So just something to be aware of, that there are sort of two separate ways that you can use the ORCID in particular. The impact story, somebody noted the badges are nice. And I agree. I am a fan of kind of the simple, colorful visual badges. People can disagree about whether that information is valuable within their work, and that's okay. We're each going to have a different perspective, but I do very much like their clean approach to the display. And then somebody else mentioned the cited by column in the Google Scholar profiles, so you can see kind of who's reading and using your work. That's a nice feature to just have built in right there at your fingertips. So I am going to restart my slideshow now. Let's see. All right, so hopefully you are seeing my slides again. Let me know if you're not. All right, so we're going to move on a little bit now from our online profiles. The next thing I want to talk about is maintaining your pipeline. No rest for the academic. So what we're talking about here is your research pipeline, thinking about, I've gotten one paper out, what is coming next? What's coming down the pipe in my work? You want to really have a rough plan. Obviously, it's going to evolve. It'll evolve a little each day. It'll evolve a lot over time, and that's okay. But you want to kind of have some rough sense of where you're interested in going to continue to grow and build on your research. And you don't want to wait until one project is totally complete to decide what you're going to start next. It just kind of costs you time and momentum to be completely at a standstill and then trying to think about, okay, what am I going to start, and then having to gear back up. So we want to start thinking about how we can use the waiting periods in one project to make progress on another. So depending on the kind of work we're doing, early on, we may need to submit a proposal for our research to a review board, particularly if you're doing research that involves human subjects. You'll go through those kinds of IRB approvals, or if you're working with animals, there's an approval process for that. So there may be a period where you've submitted your proposal and you're waiting for that official approval of your protocol to say that it's okay to proceed. That might be a waiting period where you're saying, okay, I can't do anything else on that project until they approve it. In the meantime, let me do some brainstorming on a future project. Similarly, as you get to different stages of data collection, let's say you're conducting a survey of some sort, you may have a period of time where you're simply waiting for the data to come in from your survey respondents. That's another great period of time to set that project aside and look at another. And then even once you've submitted an article to a particular journal, you know you're going to have a period of months waiting through peer review processes. So let's find a way to put that time to use on the next project in our pipeline. And we want to think strategically about how our work can build, how each individual paper can build on the others to fulfill our broader research goals and agenda. So we don't necessarily end up with a bunch of papers that are just separate little entities all over the map with no relationship to one another, but thinking about building strategically from one thing to the next. Okay. So then the next piece I want to come to here is thinking about how we track and communicate our impact. Impact is sort of a sticky concept that has very different meaning to different people in different fields, and that's okay. It's not a universal thing. We generally think about impact as being what is my work accomplishing? What is it affecting? In a very traditional perspective, we've measured that largely through citations. Pre-internet world, that was the most tangible, visible way that you could say somebody read my work and did something with it by using it in their own research. So impact tracking has largely focused on citations, historically speaking. But in the digital era, we have lots of other types of things we can look at. And we also want to be very broad and diverse, even in how we think about using the citations themselves. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we may track our impact. So scholarly citations, as I said, is sort of the traditional starting point, thinking about your paper being cited in other articles, in books, in dissertations. We can also think about citations outside of scholarly work. So citations in white papers, in policy papers, citations that would demonstrate some kind of impact on teaching, policy, practice, that kind of thing. And then what we call alt metrics or alternative metrics. This is getting into that kind of new perspectives from the digital era, where we can think about how many times a file was viewed, downloaded, saved into a profile, what kind of attention does it get on social media as well as traditional media. So thinking around the issue a little bit, a lot of these types of activity will appear much faster than citations. Citations across disciplines is going to really be a very different experience. In really fast-moving fields like health, you may expect to see a citation within that first year of publication because the work is building so quickly. But a lot of those works then may have a shorter half-life, meaning they may not be cited as much over a long period of time. You get 10 years out and that paper may not get as much attention. When we look at papers in the arts and humanities, we may often see a very different kind of experience. The citations are much slower to appear, but they will continue to accrue at a certain rate over a much longer lifespan. So we want to recognize those very, very different behaviors in different fields. We don't want to criticize a literary essay because it didn't get cited as quickly as a public health paper, because those are just such different contexts. So thinking about alt-metric things, we'll get those faster than we may get those kind of long tail citations. And it's indicative of attention. We don't yet know what someone who's paying attention to our work may do with it, but we at least know they're paying attention, and that may eventually result in scholarly citations or changes to policy and practice. With any of these kinds of measures, we want to try to go beyond a simple count. So I can tell you my article was cited 30 times. Is that number helpful? I don't know. If I can tell you who cited it and why, what did they do with it in their paper? Did they just sort of mention it in passing as one line in a lit review? Did they borrow my protocol and reproduce my methodology and validate my findings? Those two use cases would have very different significance in terms of communicating what has my work affected. So we want to be thinking about capturing who, where, why we got whatever attention we got, and how that attention is changing over time. And there's other indicators that, more general things like letters or comments from peers about the quality and benefits of your work, funding that you may have received that kind of demonstrates, okay, well, such and such funding association thought that my work was worthy of $1 million. Reviews that may be published of your work, awards, recognition within professional spheres, things like that. So those are other types of other indicators of impact we may want to keep in mind. And then thinking about how we communicate that impact. And here I kind of want to build off my point about trying to go beyond just a simple number and a count or something. The numbers are meaningless without context. We want to collect anecdotes as well as numbers that help us to characterize the impact and tell a story. So if I think about Twitter, if I'm talking about social media attention and whether my paper got noticed, I can tell you I got tweeted once. That doesn't sound very impressive. One tweet, whoop-de-doo. But if I give you the anecdote and the context and I tell you, my paper was tweeted by the president of this particular association who, in his tweet made a substantive comment about the significant value of this work and how it will impact the discipline. Well, all of a sudden, that one tweet where the number one doesn't sound exciting, the context of the tweet sounds very exciting, that it got attention at a very high level for a substantive reason. As you communicate the impact of a work, think about explaining how does that particular work move your own research agenda forward, and how does it move your discipline forward? How is it continuing to help your discipline grow and progress, build its knowledge base, accomplish its missions, that kind of thing? How does your work align with agendas outside of your own? So there may be an agenda within your discipline that says, these are some key goals that we think our field needs to be working on. Sometimes those are national and international agendas. And I use the UN's Sustainable Development Goals as an example. The UN has this list of goals that some of them relate to things like access to clean water, access to sufficient food, global education. They kind of span any number of different possible disciplines, just depending on the kind of work you do. So if you were able to talk about how your work aligned with and supported the United Nations goals, that gives you another way to characterize why your work matters. Thinking about to what extent is your work reproducible? Again, this will vary just in different fields, depending on how much this is important. If you're doing a literary analysis, you may not have as much concern about explaining your protocol in a way that's reproducible. But in science fields, things where you're testing some kind of a particular hypothesis or condition, you want to think about, have I been transparent in explaining my methodology and created work that can be replicated? And then additionally, to what extent has it been replicated? That's the kind of thing we won't see in that short-term 1-year period, but that we would be looking for over a longer-term life of our body of work. And then thinking about just how your work embodies your values, your institution's values, and the values of your discipline. I know within my field, if I go to the website of any professional association that, any association that represents people in my field, they will describe their core values. Right now, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a big thing that's in the core values and agendas for a lot of scholarly associations and professional associations. So being able to speak to those core values and talk about how your work fits into that larger value system is another way to indicate the importance of your work in your field. So digging in a little bit, how do we get all of that information? How do we find out who's citing us and how they're citing us and how many people have downloaded my paper? And so I've provided a list here of some of the core tools. This is not intended to be comprehensive necessarily, but these are the biggies that I rely on all the time in my work. In a very short session like this, I'm not going to be able to give you a really in-depth demonstration of every single one of these, but I do want to at least show you some snapshots of what we can get from each of these tools. And then you would be able to go back to these links in my slides later if you would like to explore them in more detail. So Google Scholar, I've given some screenshots here that shows if I just go to Google Scholar and do a search for myself, I can find this paper that I published, and it shows the title and authors and the abstract. And then underneath it, it says cited by. That's giving you the number of times that Google Scholar believes it has found citations of your work. If you click on that number, it will list those citing works for you. So here it says this paper was cited by 95 others. I click on that and it's going to give me the details of the 95 results that cite mine. If I wanted to, then I could start opening each one of those, reading their paper, looking for the context of how they invoked my paper. Now that number, Google is subject to a certain amount of error. just kind of be aware of that. This is another reason why we want to be careful about just taking a number. I don't necessarily want to just write down 95 and move on with my life, because some of those are going to be duplicates. Some of them will be mistakes. Some of them may be places where I have cited my own paper in a later paper, and maybe I don't really want to count self-citations talking about my impact on others. So we want to kind of think through what's in that number and what's worth including. Now, one thing I'll tell you about Google, let's say that I want to make a list of these 95 papers that cite me. Maybe I want to go ahead and start a spreadsheet to track over time who all has cited this paper. In Google, I can click the little quotation marks and get a citation. But the way this is set up, I have to click that individually for every one of these 95 papers. Boo, don't do that. Seriously, don't do that. There is a free piece of software called Publish or Perish from Dr. Ann Will Hartzing. It is a wonderful program. It pulls in Google Scholar data and then lets you download it and manipulate it in other ways. Excuse me. And I think I have, yes, that's the next thing I have some screenshots of here is Publish or Perish. So I searched for the exact same article of mine. And after finding the article, it has the same 95 here, saying it has 95 citations. And then I can do a command to retrieve the citing works. And it will bring up like a spreadsheet of those 95 articles. And from there, I can save those results, export them into Excel, and manipulate that data further. So very cool free program. It does also leverage data from places other than Google Scholar. It incorporates a number of different data sets. So again, one of those things I can't go into detail on everything it does, but for researchers, Publish or Perish is a very cool piece of software. All right, the Web of Science database. This is one of the article databases available from our library. It's a place you can go just to find articles when you're doing research, but you can also use it to get some information about your work if the journal you published in is included in Web of Science. So this article is in here. Web of Science says it's cited 34 times. They have a different bucket of stuff they're looking at. Google's going to look at anything that Google is able to get its hands on. Web of Science is just going to look at the journals indexed in Web of Science. So it's telling you this article was cited 34 times in other articles that I also have in my smaller bucket. That bucket will be much more error-free. It will be a much more accurate bucket, but just be aware that it will exclude certain journals, and it will not pull in things like dissertations or conference presentations that may have cited you. So Google is a little bit more error prone, but also spreads a broader net. And so very similar to Google, you can click on that number and it will pull up a search and show you those 34 articles that cite you. And then you could dig into them in more detail if you choose. There is another product very similar to Web of Science called Scopus. They are maintained by basically two competing companies. So they aim to do the same kind of thing, but their data set is a little different. They are both terribly expensive. So many universities only subscribe to one unless they are very wealthy. So that is why here at SAM, you will find Web of Science, you will not find Scopus. But when you eventually go out and are affiliated with other universities, you may have access to Scopus instead or also. So just kind of being aware, it will perform a very similar function. Oh, okay. I forgot I was going to go into this. So this is something I find very confusing in Web of Science. How do they count? They seem to be bad at math. They're not. It's just very confusing. On the first screenshot, you see 34. If you look at the second screenshot up at the top right, it says citing articles 29. And I was staring at this going, where'd the other 5 go? What is this 34 versus 29? So they go into detail, and basically it is cited 29 times in the Web of Science core collection in journals. So there's 29 journal articles. Then they found 5 conference citations that are also in their core collection. And then way over here, it explains that there was also one citation in an Arabic citation index that is outside of their core. So they're now getting into even smaller buckets and counting things and adding them up. And I find it very confusing the way they present that. So just be aware that it's another reason to not just take a number and run with it. You need to make sure you really know what that number means, because even within their own interface, they won't give you the same number. Okay, Cite. This is the next tool I wanted to look at, Cite.ai. Cite is a relatively new tool, and they're trying to pull together all sorts of data about which papers cite each other, but then they try to go a little deeper and say, how do they cite each other? And they classify those citations as mentioning, supporting, or contrasting. So there may just be a mention, which is relatively neutral. Or if it's something that they look at the language and it is very much supporting, saying something like, I have validated their findings, my findings agree with their findings, those kinds of things. They'll call those out. Or contrasting is where an article has maybe contradicted your findings or disagreed with you on something. So they're trying to classify that language. That is done by artificial intelligence. It may not be perfect, but make what you will of it. This will give you some numbers of how many citations they found, what the nature of them is. Dimensions.ai, I love this one, and we're going to take a look at this in an activity in just a second. This one will pull together scholarly publication references. It's telling me it finds 8 for this same paper. But then if you look over to the left, it's also showing a dimensions badge and an altmetric badge. So this is some other sets of information. The altmetric badge is pulling together that stuff we talked about, like views and downloads and social media. And if I click on that, oops, right, I forgot I'm in screenshots here. If I click on the altmetric badge, it's going to show me some other data dashboards like this. They'll get into geographical breakdown of where are the people who tweeted about your paper, where are the people who saved your paper into their Mendeley library. The geography may not matter to you. It depends on the context of your work. But if you are trying to affect change in some particular region, being able to show that your work is actually getting into that region may be important. If we click instead on this dimensions badge, this is going to show me some more detail about citations that they've found, recency of citations, and something called the field citation ratio, which tries to express your quantity of citations relative to your discipline as a whole. So do you get cited more or less than your discipline on average? What I really love about this page is not just these little number dials, but the text itself, because it explains the numbers. So it tells you this article has been cited 41 times. 39% of those are received in the past 2 years, which is higher than you might expect, suggesting it's currently receiving a lot of interest. Compared to other publications in the same field, it's very highly cited and has received approximately 20 times more citations than average. That's actually language you can take for communicating what the heck that number means and putting it in context. So I really, really love that. Within some of the individual publisher platforms. So this journal is published by Elsevier. This is the way the article appears on the actual publisher's platform. And they also have altmetric badges embedded. When you see this little donut, this little colorful wheel, that's actually from a specific company named Altmetric. So that badge, that donut, they call it, should be the same in any different platform where you find the donut, because that's all coming from the same data provider. Right. PlumX is another one of these providers that's a competitor with Altmetric. So this is an example of my article on the PlumX dashboard that again is pulling together citations, usage. And so this is showing some more details within EBSCO databases of people viewing the article. people capturing and saving it, and then some social media activity. And this is just another screenshot showing within the publisher's platform how they link out from, they kind of show a short version of these Plenex metrics and then link out to the complete version. So there's a lot of different places that we're finding lots of disparate information. But just to get a little piece of it, just to get a taste, I'm going to have you do an activity here. Pull open dimensions.ai, and there'll be a button you can click to say access the free web app. And just search for someone who is of interest to you. It could be an advisor, a mentor, or just a current, like, big hot researcher in your field. Don't go classic, because classic, like, historical researchers aren't going to have much of this digital contemporary data. But think of somebody to look around for and just kind of explore a few other publications. See what sorts of data is available and what you find interesting about it, what it might tell you. We'll take a couple of minutes on this and then we'll come back together and discuss. All right, I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this activity a little bit short so we can do some wrap up. Does anybody want to share any particular comments or observations about what they saw in the dimensions data? Okay, that's all right. If we don't have anything to share right now, that's okay too. All right, so we will go ahead and wrap up the end of this. So what's the final product? We talk about all of this sort of disparate citations and downloads and awards, and how do we pull all this together? What are we doing with it? So what we want to do initially, the first step really is write a story. Write it out as a story about who you are as a researcher, what you do, what you're trying to achieve, big picture, and what you believe you've accomplished so far. Then you can pull in these little pieces of data, weave in these indicators as evidence that support various points in your story. Remember, trying to include both the quantitative numbers and the qualitative data, some of those strong anecdotes and substantive comments. And you can use this narrative to justify, whether it's in a grant application, justifying the future work you want them to pay for based on the impact of the past work. You can also reference it in fellowship and job applications, and eventually perhaps the tenure and promotion application. I realize all of this can probably sound a little overwhelming, maybe a lot overwhelming. There's a lot of pieces to this. It's a lot of information and a lot to take in. Yeah, it definitely can be. My main advice is be strategic. Don't try to capture every single number possible about every work. You will get overwhelmed. Start compiling as soon as your paper starts getting cited. Start compiling the works that cite you into a master list that you can just add to over time, and then reference that whenever an up-to-date snapshot is needed. That's easier than waiting until you've got 100 citations and then going in and trying to parse and make sense of them. And when you get lost in the weeds here, ask for advice, faculty mentors, peers, your scholarly and professional association networks, and yes, even the library, me or my counterpart at whatever institution you end up at. Come and ask for help. My slides will have a list here of some further resources that you can look at online for promoting your work, building your profiles, tracking citations, kind of all the pieces that we touched on a little bit. There's some resources here for you to dig in deeper on any of those. And with that, I will say thank you. And I know we're almost out of time, but if you have any questions for me, please do feel free to speak up.
I just want to thank you for, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I just want to thank you for your